The church bells tolled, echoing like a heartbeat across the marble hall. Just as Jonathan Hale was about to vow forever to the woman he loved, a boy tugged at his sleeve, leaned close, and whispered a sentence that shattered the silence. "Your bride has a secret tattoo." Jonathan froze at the altar. The guests waited for his smile, but instead they saw the color drain from his face. The church was filled with the soft glow of stained glass light, spilling patches of red and blue across the marble floor. Rows of guests sat in perfect silence, their faces turned toward the altar where Jonathan Hale, a man whose fortune had been built on steel and glass towers, stood tall in a black suit tailored like armor. His expression was calm, composed, the look of a man in absolute control of his world. The music swelled, and at the far end of the aisle, his bride, Emily Carter, appeared, radiant in a white gown that seemed to float with every step. The crowd exhaled in unison at the sight of her. She walked slowly, with the grace of someone who had spent weeks rehearsing for this very moment, her veil softening the fire of her auburn hair. Jonathan's chest tightened with something rare, something money had never been able to buy: anticipation, hope, a future that felt certain. When Emily reached the altar, she placed her trembling hand in his. Their eyes met, and for a moment it seemed nothing could disturb the fragile perfection of the scene. The priest opened his book and began to speak, words that flowed like a river carrying them toward their vows. And then, without warning, a small figure broke the stillness. A boy no older than 7, dressed in a wrinkled suit too big for him, crept up the steps to the altar. He belonged to one of the bridesmaids, a restless child who had already drawn a few amused smiles earlier in the ceremony. No one tried to stop him now. Everyone assumed he simply wanted a better view. The boy tugged at Jonathan's sleeve. Jonathan glanced down, startled, and bent slightly so he could hear. The boy cupped his tiny hand around his mouth and whispered, his voice sharp in its innocence, "Your bride has a secret tattoo." The words, though quiet, seemed to echo louder than the organ itself. Jonathan stiffened. His fingers loosened around Emily's hand. For the first time in years, the man who had faced boardroom wars and million-dollar betrayals felt his blood run cold. The whispers of the child coiled through the silence of the church, and the guests leaned forward, sensing something had shifted. Emily's lips parted, as though she too had heard the impossible message. Jonathan's gaze swept across her face, searching for a flicker of truth or denial. And in that fragile second, the air in the church turned heavy, charged with suspicion, and the promise of forever trembled at the edge of breaking. Emily's breath caught the moment she saw Jonathan's eyes change. The warmth she had leaned on so many times flickered, replaced by a piercing uncertainty that cut through her like glass. For a heartbeat she felt as though she were standing alone at the altar, surrounded not by friends and family, but by strangers, waiting for her mask to fall. The whisper still lingered in the air, invisible but deafening. Her mind raced backward, beyond the silk dress and flowers, beyond the polished smile she had worn for the cameras of society. She was no stranger to whispers. They had followed her in high school corridors, when classmates learned she lived in a trailer park at the edge of town. They had echoed in the shadows of cheap motels when she was too young, too desperate, running from a home where bottles shattered louder than any lullaby. Whispers were always there, sharp and merciless. And now, one had followed her here, into the one place she believed she had finally escaped them. The tattoo. Just the thought of it made her shoulders tense beneath the lace of her gown. It was hidden, etched between her shoulder blade and spine, in a place no one could see unless she chose to reveal it. A mark she had gotten in a dimly lit shop when she was 17, with trembling hands and a heart still bruised from nights she never spoke about. A phoenix rising from ash, though at the time she hadn't felt like rising. It had been less of a symbol, more of a plea, a reminder to herself that she was still here, still breathing, even if every breath hurt. She had never told Jonathan. not because she was ashamed of it, but because she had feared what it represented. To him she was Emily Carter, the refined, steady woman who smiled through charity galas and knew the right wine to order. She wasn't the girl who slept in bus stations or bore bruises in silence. The girl with the tattoo didn't belong in his world of skyscrapers and silk ties, and yet the truth remained inked into her skin, a secret carried like a brand of survival. Now, under the watchful eyes of hundreds, she felt it pulsing there, as if the phoenix itself was trying to claw free. Jonathan's grip on her hand faltered, and she swallowed hard, forcing herself not to look away. The boy had no idea what storm he had unleashed. Perhaps he had glimpsed it once, when she bent to pick him up during the rehearsal dinner, the lace of her blouse slipping just enough. Perhaps it was simple, childish curiosity, but the effect was catastrophic. Emily drew in a steadying breath. She had dreamed of this day since Jonathan proposed, imagined walking away from her broken past and into the safety of his love. But safety built on silence was never real. The tattoo had always been waiting, like a locked door in a house she'd tried to pretend had no secrets. And now the key had been turned. Her eyes lifted to Jonathan's once more, and though her lips didn't move, her heart spoke the words she dreaded. He will see me for what I was, not what I've become. Jonathan's jaw tightened as the silence in the church stretched into something unbearable. He felt the weight of every pair of eyes pressing down on him, expectant, almost hungry for his reaction. The priest's voice faltered, his words collapsing into the charged air. The organist's hands froze above the keys. Even the flickering candles along the altar seemed to burn lower, as though the building itself was holding its breath. He should have brushed it off. A child's whisper, an innocent accident. Nothing more. But Jonathan Hale was not a man accustomed to surprises, and he was certainly not a man who tolerated secrets. His life had been built on precision, contracts signed with perfect clauses, partnerships forged only when every weakness had been unearthed and measured. Secrets destroyed empires, and Jonathan had vowed long ago never to be blindsided. His eyes narrowed on Emily. She stood motionless beside him, her face pale beneath the veil, her lips trembling with words unsaid. And it was that silence, her refusal to deny, her inability to laugh it off, that struck him hardest. She knew. She knew exactly what the boy was talking about, and that realization was like ice spreading through his veins. The guests shifted uneasily, their whispers beginning to grow like a rustling tide. He could hear fragments. Tattoo. Is it true? What does it mean? His boardroom instincts told him this was spiraling. That control was slipping through his fingers in front of an audience that thrived on gossip. To them, he wasn't just Jonathan the groom. He was Jonathan Hale, the man who sat on magazine covers, the tycoon whose name adorned skyscrapers. And now, in the middle of his carefully curated fairy tale, scandal was clawing its way in. Jonathan's grip on Emily's hand loosened. His thoughts, sharp as broken glass, cut into him. What else has she kept from me? What kind of past does she carry on her skin? He had believed her to be flawless, untouched by the shadows that plagued lesser lives. He had believed their union would be free of the chaos he'd fought his whole career to rise above. Yet here she was, standing before him, branded with a truth he didn't know. His chest rose and fell in measured breaths, but inside he was unraveling. He remembered the nights he had lain awake, imagining her as the one thing in his life that wasn't a deal, wasn't a calculation. Emily had been pure light in a world of steel and money, but now doubt wormed its way into that vision, staining it with questions he wasn't ready to face. Still, beneath the shock and anger, another voice whispered inside him, quieter but persistent. Does it matter? Does ink on her skin erase the woman you love? Or are you afraid of the story it tells? The conflict raged in him, unseen by the crowd, but felt by Emily, who searched his eyes for any sign of forgiveness. And as Jonathan stood frozen at the altar, a man accustomed to commanding everything, he realized he had never felt so powerless in his life. Emily felt the silence close in on her like a tightening noose. The whispers of the crowd swirled around her, but all she could see was Jonathan, his steady hand now trembling slightly, his eyes locked on hers, with a storm she both feared and longed to calm. She knew this moment could shatter everything. She could pretend, deflect, laugh it off as the fantasy of a restless child. But lies had been the currency of her survival for too long, and she couldn't build the rest of her life on them. Her throat tightened, and for a moment she thought her voice would fail her. But then she drew in a breath, one deep enough to steady the tremor in her chest. Her hand, still caught loosely in Jonathan's, pressed against his palm. She raised her chin, her voice carrying through the vaulted ceiling of the church, clear and breaking all at once. "It's true," she said. A gasp rippled through the pews. Someone coughed nervously, others shifted in their seats, but no one looked away. The confession hung there, fragile but undeniable. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs, but she pushed forward. "I have a tattoo. It's hidden. And yes, I never told you about it, Jonathan. Not because I wanted to deceive you, but because of what it means. Because of what it says about the life I came from." Her eyes glistened, though her voice grew stronger. "I wasn't born into privilege or safety. My father was a man who drowned himself in whiskey, a man whose anger left scars I carried long before I could understand them. By the time I was 16, I was living more on the streets than in a home. I worked any job I could, slept wherever there was space. And one night, when I felt like I was drowning, I walked into a tattoo parlor with a crumpled $20 bill and told them to put something permanent on me, something that would remind me I could rise again. She paused, her fingers brushing her gown as though she could feel the ink beneath her skin even now. "It's a phoenix between my shoulders. I marked myself with fire because I needed to believe I could come back from the ashes of the life I was given. It was my secret, my shield, my proof that I could survive." Her gaze never left Jonathan, even as the congregation buzzed with stunned disbelief. "I didn't tell you because I wanted you to see me as I am now, not as the broken girl I used to be. I didn't want my past to become a shadow over our future. But the truth has a way of finding us, and if I am to stand here and promise you forever, then you need to know all of me, not just the parts polished enough for the world." Her voice faltered and her eyes brimmed with tears, but she didn't look away. "This is who I am, Jonathan, the girl who fought to be here, the woman who chose you. If that makes me unworthy, then let it end here. But if you still love me knowing this truth." The church was silent again, but it was a different silence now, thick, charged, and waiting. Emily's hands trembled in Jonathan's, and though her confession had left her exposed, she felt lighter, as though the burden she had carried for years had finally been laid at his feet. Jonathan's world tilted as Emily's words sank into him like stones falling into deep water. He stood rigid, his body betraying nothing, but inside he was unraveling thread by thread. The church was utterly still again, yet he could feel the collective gaze of every guest pressing down on him, waiting for his verdict. To them, this was more than a wedding. It was a spectacle, and his reaction would decide whether it became a fairy tale or a scandal whispered about for decades. His chest felt tight, each breath strained against the weight of conflicting thoughts. A part of him seethed. How could she keep this from him? Jonathan Hale, who demanded full disclosure in every deal, every contract, every partnership. He had built his empire on knowing every hidden clause, every unspoken risk. And here was the woman he intended to marry, confessing that she had hidden an entire chapter of her life. He had believed Emily to be flawless, untouched by the shadows that haunted most lives. He had put her on a pedestal, seeing her as a beacon of purity in his carefully guarded world. Now that image cracked, and the sound of it breaking roared inside him, yet beneath the anger something else tugged at him, a fragile, piercing sorrow. He looked at her and didn't see deceit. He saw a trembling honesty, a vulnerability so raw it shook him. He imagined her at 17, bruised by a world that had abandoned her, clutching at a tattoo needle as if it could carve hope into her skin. The image wounded him deeper than the secret itself. This wasn't a lie born of malice. It was silence born of survival. Jonathan's jaw clenched. His pride shouted that he had been betrayed, that a man of his stature could not stand at the altar, humiliated before his peers. But his heart, the part of him he so rarely let speak, whispered that he loved her, not for the image she projected, but for the quiet strength she carried in her every gesture, the way she touched his hand when he was restless, the way she listened without judgment, the way she laughed like it was the first time she had ever been allowed to. He stared into her eyes, those eyes that had always seemed unbreakable, and saw now the fracture lines of a woman who had fought her way out of the dark. The guests blurred at the edges of his vision. The whispers faded. There was only Emily, standing before him, holding nothing back at last. But fear gnawed at him too. Fear that accepting her meant stepping into a story he couldn't control, a past that might resurface at any moment. He had spent a lifetime building walls around himself, and Emily was asking him to open them to fire. His pulse thundered in his ears. He felt torn between two selves, the man who demanded perfection and the man who longed, desperately, for something real. His silence stretched on, each second heavy with judgment, and he knew Emily could see the battle raging inside him. For the first time in his life, Jonathan Hale, the man who always knew exactly what to say, found himself at the edge of words, drowning in the choice between pride and love. Jonathan's silence stretched so long it felt like an eternity suspended in the vaulted air of the church. Every second of hesitation was another lash across Emily's heart, and the congregation sat rigid, like spectators at an execution. Some leaned forward, hungry for the collapse of perfection, while others averted their eyes as though ashamed to witness what might come. The priest's hands tightened around his book, his lips pressed into a thin line. Even the boy who had spoken the words fidgeted uneasily, sensing he had set something in motion far greater than himself. Jonathan inhaled deeply, the sound ragged in his chest. He looked at Emily, at the trembling strength in her posture, and then out at the crowd. He saw judgment there, faces lined with curiosity, whispers hovering like daggers, but he also saw something that jolted him: pity. They were waiting for him to cast her aside, to confirm their cynical belief that love among the powerful was conditional, that even at the altar a man like him could treat a bride as disposable if she was anything less than flawless. And in that moment, Jonathan realized the choice before him was not just about Emily. It was about the man he had become and the man he wanted to be. His entire life he had controlled, calculated, won. But none of it had ever felt like this: raw, terrifying, alive. He thought of the nights he had spent with her, moments small and unguarded. Emily laughing barefoot in his kitchen while the world outside demanded his presence. Emily's hand reaching for his when the weight of his empire threatened to break him. Emily looking at him not as the tycoon Jonathan Hale, but as a man. His throat tightened. His pride still clawed at him, insisting he had been betrayed, that he should walk away. But something stronger rose from beneath the fear, a truth as undeniable as the air he breathed. He loved her with a ferocity that made the past irrelevant. The tattoo, the secrets, the scars, they were not stains. They were proof that she had endured, and that she stood before him not broken, but unyielding. Jonathan's hand, which had slipped from hers, found its way back. He clasped Emily's fingers with deliberate strength, lifting them high enough for all to see. His voice, when it finally broke the silence, carried like thunder through the church. "I love this woman," he said, "not for the life she once lived, but for the strength she carries today. If she bears a mark of survival, then it is not a shame. It is her crown. And I will wear that truth with her for as long as I live. Gasps scattered through the crowd, but this time they were laced with awe, not scandal. A murmur of approval swelled, as if the room itself had exhaled. Emily's knees nearly buckled with relief as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. Jonathan turned to her fully now, no longer caring for the audience, only for the woman before him. His eyes softened, though his grip was iron. Emily, I don't need your past to be spotless. I only need your future to be ours. The guests erupted into applause, some standing, others dabbing at their eyes. The priest cleared his throat, visibly moved, and reopened his book to continue. But in that instant, the vows were already spoken, not in ritual, but in truth, seared into the hearts of everyone present. The reception hall glimmered with chandeliers, their light spilling over crystal glasses and gilded plates. Guests milled about in clusters, still buzzing from the drama of the ceremony. Some spoke in hushed tones, their words laced with disbelief, while others praised Jonathan for his declaration, calling it the most romantic thing they had ever witnessed. But Emily felt their eyes on her everywhere she moved. She knew the whispers hadn't died. They had only shifted shape. The secret was still alive in the air, unresolved, demanding to be faced. She stood near the center of the room, her heart racing beneath the lace bodice of her gown. Jonathan was at her side, his arm protectively around her waist, but she felt the weight of a decision pressing on her shoulders. If she let the tattoo remain an unspoken rumor, it would linger like a shadow over their marriage. A ghost whispered about at every dinner party, a mark of scandal no declaration of love could fully erase. If she revealed it herself, she risked humiliation, but she would reclaim the truth on her own terms. Emily's hand trembled as she took the microphone from the band's stand. The chatter dwindled, then fell away completely. Hundreds of eyes turned to her. She could almost hear her pulse echoing in the silence. Jonathan's brow furrowed as he glanced at her, uncertain, but she gave his hand a small squeeze, silently begging him to trust her. "I know what you're all thinking," she began, her voice clear though her chest quaked. "Today was not the perfect wedding you expected. A secret was spoken, and yes, it's true. I have a tattoo." A murmur rippled through the hall, but she raised her hand, steady, commanding the room. "What matters is why." Slowly, deliberately, Emily reached behind her and lowered the zipper of her gown just enough to bare her shoulder blades. Gasps echoed as the ink came into view, delicate yet powerful, a phoenix rising in shades of black and scarlet, wings stretched wide across her back. The chandelier light caught the curves of the design, making the bird seem alive, aflame. "This," she said, her voice stronger now, "is not a mark of shame. It is the story of my survival. I was a girl once who thought she was nothing more than ashes. This tattoo reminded me that even in the darkest fire, there is the promise of flight, that I could rise again, that I was worth more than the pain that tried to destroy me." The room was hushed, the air electric. She scanned the faces, some tearful, some stunned, some awed. "I never wanted to hide it because it was ugly. I hid it because I thought you might not understand. But love, real love, demands that we bring our whole selves, scars and all, to the person we choose. So here I am, all of me." For a moment, silence reigned. Then, one guest began to clap, another joined. And then, like a wave breaking, the entire hall erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, some cheering, others wiping at their eyes. The sound swelled until it filled every corner of the room, drowning out the last remnants of shame. Emily pulled the gown back into place, her cheeks wet with tears but her smile radiant, unshaken. Jonathan stepped forward, kissed her temple, and whispered into her ear, "You've never been more beautiful than you are right now." And as the applause thundered around them, Emily felt lighter than she had in years, because at last her secret was no longer her burden. It had become her triumph. The limousine hummed quietly as it carried them away from the reception, the city lights flickering across the tinted windows like distant stars. Emily sat with her back pressed against the leather seat, her gown spilling around her like a pool of ivory. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to exhale fully, to let the weight that had clung to her for years finally slip away. She felt raw, exposed, but also reborn. The tattoo that had once been her silent burden was no longer a secret whispered in shadows. It had become a truth embraced in the open. Jonathan sat beside her, his hand firmly clasped around hers, his thumb tracing lazy, grounding circles across her skin. He hadn't spoken much since her reveal, but his silence was no longer heavy with doubt. It was steady, protective, and filled with a kind of reverence she had never seen in his eyes before. When he finally turned to her, his expression was softer than she had ever known. "You realize," he murmured, his voice low, almost amused, "you just redefined what it means to give a wedding speech." Emily laughed, the sound trembling at first, then blossoming into something pure. It was laughter not born from politeness or fear of judgment, but from relief. "I didn't plan any of it," she admitted, "but I couldn't keep hiding. Not from you, not from myself." Jonathan leaned closer, his forehead resting briefly against hers. "Good, because I don't want perfection, Emily. I want you. Every scar, every story, every piece of the life that made you strong enough to stand beside me." His hand lifted, brushing a strand of hair away from her damp cheek. "That's the woman I fell in love with. That's the woman I vowed to marry today." Her eyes filled with tears again, but these were different. Light, not heavy. She squeezed his hand, the diamond of her ring catching a gleam of the passing city lights. For the first time, she truly believed in the forever she had promised him, not as a fragile illusion, but as something built on unshakable ground. Outside, the city seemed to celebrate with them. Car horns in the distance, neon signs glowing, the hum of life carrying on. But inside the car, there was only the two of them, cocooned in a world of their own. Jonathan reached into the side compartment, pulling out a bottle of champagne someone had tucked away. He popped the cork, the sound echoing like a cheer, and poured them each a glass. "To us," he said, raising his flute. Emily met his gaze, her smile radiant through tears. "To rising from the ashes." They clinked glasses, the soft chime ringing with the weight of everything they had endured and everything that lay ahead. The champagne was crisp, but sweeter somehow, as though the day itself had transformed it. As the limousine carried them forward into the night, Emily leaned against Jonathan's shoulder, the warmth of his arm wrapping around her. For the first time in years, she no longer felt like she was running from her past. Instead, she felt as though she was stepping into the future with someone who had chosen not just her light, but her fire. And with the steady beat of Jonathan's heart beneath her ear, Emily knew. This was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of the life she had fought so hard to believe she deserved. What makes this story powerful, in my view, is not the spectacle of scandal at the altar, but the transformation that follows. It begins with fear, the fear of exposure, of losing love when the truth is revealed. Yet what could have destroyed Emily and Jonathan becomes the very fire that forges their bond. The tattoo, once a mark of shame, turns into a symbol of strength, and Jonathan's choice to embrace it demonstrates that love is not about perfection, but about courage, honesty, and acceptance. The beauty of the ending lies in its realism. A fairy tale wedding collapses into chaos, but out of that chaos emerges something truer than any flawless image. Two people choosing each other not despite their scars, but because of them. To me, it's a story that says the happiest endings are not those free of darkness, but those where two souls walk through the darkness together and find the light on the other side. Do you want me to write this opinion in a poetic style, as if it were an afterword at the end of a novel, or keep it more like a reflective commentary, almost like a critic's note?